Winston Churchill steps down from his aircraft onto a frozen German airfield. Ahead of him lies what should have been a triumph, Operation Plunder, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's grand Rhine crossing, planned for months, meticulously staged, politically vital. Then a staff officer approaches. Prime Minister, Patton crossed the Rhine last night. Not today, not under Montgomery's command, but quietly, aggressively, without permission. Montgomery's response is immediate and explosive. Patton must be fired, today. Within hours, Churchill will face a choice no victory speech ever prepared him for: British prestige or American results, protocol or speed, his favorite general or the man winning the war faster than anyone else. What Churchill said next, on that airfield, in a private letter to Eisenhower, and later in a whispered confession, would quietly mark the end of British military dominance in modern warfare, and it would never be said publicly.
Operation Plunder was more than a military maneuver, it was a political statement. For Bernard Montgomery, this Rhine crossing was designed to prove that British doctrine, deliberate, methodical, overwhelming, still defined modern warfare. 2 months of preparation, massive airborne landings, artillery timed to the second. Churchill himself had flown in to witness it. The Rhine was the last great natural barrier before Germany's heartland. Whoever crossed it first would shape the final narrative of the war in Europe. Montgomery intended that narrative to be British. This mattered because his reputation was already strained. Market Garden had failed. His public comments after the Battle of the Bulge had enraged American commanders. Eisenhower had been forced into diplomatic damage control just weeks earlier. Plunder was meant to restore balance, to justify why Montgomery still commanded American forces at all. What no one on Montgomery's staff fully accounted for was George Patton's Third Army, already probing the Rhine with far less ceremony and far more urgency.
Patton did not wait. At Oppenheim, his engineers found the Rhine lightly defended, a fact that contradicted weeks of cautious intelligence assumptions. Patton made a decision that violated alliance etiquette, but aligned perfectly with his philosophy of war. He crossed anyway. No airborne spectacle, no press, no orchestration. Just assault boats, engineers, and infantry. Many from Pennsylvania units Patton later joked were angry enough to swim the river if they had to. At 10 p.m., the first boats slipped across. By dawn, Patton's men held a bridgehead east of the Rhine. When Patton called Eisenhower, he didn't ask permission. He said, "Brad and I are across." That single sentence detonated Montgomery's entire operation before it even began.
Montgomery was furious. To him, Patton hadn't just broken protocol, he had undermined British authority, stolen strategic credit, and exposed the fragility of the alliance itself. Montgomery demanded action, immediate action. He insisted Patton be relieved of command, even court-martialed for insubordination. This was not just about the Rhine. It was about ego, legacy, and control, and many Allied officers quietly understood that. Market Garden still hung over Montgomery like a shadow. The Bulge controversy had already made American generals consider resignation, and now Patton had preempted the one operation meant to reassert Montgomery's relevance. Montgomery believed Churchill would back him. After all, Churchill had once called him Britain's greatest field commander. But the Prime Minister had just received news that the war might end weeks earlier because of what Patton had done, and Churchill understood something Montgomery did not. The Soviets were advancing fast, and history would not wait for perfect plans.
The meeting took place not in a grand headquarters, but on a cold, exposed German airfield, wind cutting through coats, engines idling nearby. Montgomery confronted Churchill directly.
To Montgomery, this was insubordination on a scale that threatened Allied command itself. If Patton could ignore operational authority and still be rewarded, then coalition warfare collapsed into chaos. He pressed the point hard. Patton, Montgomery insisted, had humiliated Britain in front of the world. Churchill listened. Those nearby noticed something unusual. He did not interrupt. No cigar gestures, no rhetorical flourishes, just silence. Churchill understood the danger immediately, not just militarily, but politically. British newspapers had already framed plunder as the defining operation of the Western Front. The King was watching, Parliament was watching, but so were the Americans. And Churchill knew that firing Patton would not restore harmony, it would detonate it. Montgomery expected loyalty. What he received instead was something colder, calculation. Churchill ended the exchange without committing to anything. For Montgomery, that silence was ominous.
Dwight D. Eisenhower received Montgomery's demand within hours. It placed him in an impossible position. Montgomery was still technically Patton's superior for the northern operations. The British public viewed him as the architect of Allied victory. Removing his authority risked shattering British morale. But firing Patton would have consequences Eisenhower could not ignore. Patton's Third Army was moving faster than any Allied force in Europe. His Rhine crossing had already forced German units to abandon defensive positions. The collapse was accelerating. There was also memory. Just weeks earlier, Montgomery's public comments about the Battle of the Bulge had nearly caused a revolt among senior American generals. Eisenhower had barely contained it. This time, the stakes were higher. Eisenhower drafted a response, but hesitated before sending it. He knew whatever he wrote would define not just Patton's fate, but who truly led the Western Allied war effort. And he waited to hear from Churchill first.
That night, Churchill put pen to paper. The letter to Eisenhower was careful, almost surgical. No rebukes, no praise, just reality. Churchill acknowledged Montgomery's anger. He acknowledged the breach of protocol. But he framed Patton's action in terms that mattered most to him: results. The Rhine had been crossed. German defenses were unraveling. Time, especially with Soviet forces racing west, was now the decisive factor. Churchill did not explicitly defend Patton. He did something more powerful. He declined to condemn him. Between the lines was a message Eisenhower understood instantly. Do not punish success. Do not slow momentum. End the war. It was a quiet shift, almost invisible to the public, but it marked the moment when British influence gave way to American operational dominance. Churchill sealed the letter. Montgomery would not like what came next.
Eisenhower read Churchill's letter twice. He did not need to read it a third time. The message was unmistakable, not in what it said, but in what it refused to say. Churchill had given him political cover without issuing an order. That was deliberate. Eisenhower responded with precision. Patton would not be fired. There would be no court-martial. There would be no public reprimand. Instead, Eisenhower framed Patton's Rhine crossing as an operational opportunity, one that would now be exploited to accelerate the collapse of German resistance across central Germany. Montgomery's authority remained intact on paper. In practice, it had been overtaken by events. Eisenhower understood coalition warfare better than anyone alive. Discipline mattered, but so did momentum, and Patton had created momentum no headquarters plan could replicate. The decision was not announced. It was implemented. From that moment on, Allied operations would follow the fastest advance, not the most carefully staged one.
Montgomery waited. No firing order came. No rebuke of Patton appeared in communiques. No public affirmation of British primacy followed. Instead, reports filtered in. Patton's forces were pushing east at speed. German units were withdrawing faster than expected. Bridges were falling intact. Montgomery understood exactly what had happened. This was not defeat in battle. It was loss of influence. His Rhine crossing went ahead, executed flawlessly, just as planned. But the world's attention had already moved on. The strategic story had changed. For the first time since North Africa, Montgomery found himself executing a perfect operation that no longer defined the war. Among Allied officers, a quiet conclusion spread, never stated aloud, but widely understood. The age of deliberate set-piece warfare was ending. Speed now mattered more than ceremony. Montgomery would remain indispensable, but he would no longer be decisive.
Patton was informed of the outcome without ceremony. No apology, no congratulations. That was enough for him. Patton understood Montgomery better than most. He knew the demand to fire him had never really been about discipline. It was about narrative, about who would be remembered as the man who broke Germany's last natural barrier. Patton did not gloat. He simply pushed forward. Within days, Third Army was racing deeper into Germany, seizing crossings, capturing supply depots, forcing German units to surrender without major engagements. Patton later remarked privately that wars were not won by perfect plans, but by commanders willing to act when opportunity appeared. He never mentioned Montgomery by name. He didn't have to. History was already doing that for him.
Late March 1945. Churchill met Montgomery again, but this time without an audience. No aides, no staff, no airfield theatrics. Montgomery restated his case calmly, emphasizing discipline, hierarchy, and coalition order. He expected, at minimum, a formal reprimand of Patton, something that would restore the principle of control. Churchill responded with restraint. He acknowledged the breach. He acknowledged Montgomery's frustration, but he did not reverse Eisenhower's decision, nor did he promise future authority over American forces. Instead, Churchill redirected the conversation to outcomes: German withdrawals, collapsing resistance, and the race toward central Germany. To Montgomery, it was unmistakable. Churchill was no longer arguing doctrine. He was arguing time. The meeting ended politely, but Montgomery left knowing that the political ground beneath him had shifted permanently, and that no appeal would change it.
That evening, Churchill spoke not as Prime Minister, but as a tired man nearing the end of a long war. According to the private diary of his physician, Lord Moran, Churchill reflected on the day's events with unusual frankness. Away from speeches and strategy, he admitted something he would never say publicly. The Americans, he suggested, no longer fought wars the way Britain did. They moved faster. They accepted risk. They exploited opportunity without waiting for perfection. Churchill did not frame this as failure, but as reality. British doctrine, built on careful preparation and control, had been overtaken by a new style of warfare, driven by scale, speed, and industrial momentum. Patton's Rhine crossing had made that undeniable. It was not said in anger. It was said with resignation, and with understanding that the world Britain once led was already changing.
There was no announcement, no correction, no public reckoning. The war simply moved on. Patton's Third Army surged east, capturing tens of thousands of prisoners. American forces advanced rapidly across Germany.
British and Canadian armies continued their operations with discipline and professionalism, but no longer set the pace. Montgomery remained a field marshal. Churchill remained loyal in public. The alliance remained intact. But something fundamental had ended. The Rhine crossing controversy marked the last moment when British command doctrine could realistically claim primacy in coalition warfare. From that point forward, modern war would be defined by speed, initiative, and decentralized action, the very traits Patton embodied. Churchill understood this before most, and he chose victory over pride. History followed his choice.
When the war ended, the controversy did not. Montgomery emerged publicly decorated, promoted, and celebrated, yet increasingly isolated in memory. His insistence on credit, particularly after the Battle of the Bulge, hardened American opinion permanently. Eisenhower would later describe him privately as egocentric, a judgment shaped not by a single incident, but by years of friction. Patton did not live to defend his legacy. His death in December 1945 froze him in time, reckless to some, indispensable to others. But among professional soldiers, a quieter verdict formed. Montgomery's strength had been control. Patton's had been initiative. The Rhine crossing crystallized that contrast. It was not that Montgomery was incompetent, it was that the war had outgrown him. History tends to remember results more than intentions, and momentum more than caution.
Churchill never criticized Montgomery publicly. He never praised Patton extravagantly either. Instead, he did what he always did best. He judged men in context. His famous description of Montgomery would come later, but it captured the essence already visible in 1945. Indomitable in retreat, invincible in advance, insufferable in victory. Churchill understood that ego was not unique to Montgomery. Patton had plenty of his own. But ego was tolerable when it produced speed and fatal when it delayed victory. The Rhine decision was not about favoritism. It was about ending the war before Europe burned any longer and before the Soviets claimed more of it. Churchill chose results. That choice defined the modern Western way of war.
March 23, 1945, did not end British military excellence, but it ended British military primacy. From the Rhine onward, coalition warfare would be driven by speed, logistics, and initiative, backed by overwhelming industrial power. Doctrine would follow momentum, not the other way around. Patton's unauthorized crossing did not break the alliance. It revealed its future. Churchill saw that future clearly and accepted it without illusion. He never announced it. He never celebrated it. He simply let the war move forward. And in doing so, he ensured victory. Not for Britain alone, but for the alliance that would define the modern world.